Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nobody is condoning violence against anyone, by anyone. This hearing is titled, quote, "The Right of the People Peaceably to Assemble, Protecting Speech by Stopping Anarchist Violence," end quote. But the hearing we should be having is one called "The Right of the People Peaceably to Assemble Without Being Beaten Up by Unidentifiable Federal Agents." That would address an actual problem lawful protesters are facing and the rest of us are seeing in this country. The murder of George Floyd has led to protests across the country and indeed around the world. In response, the federal government has used violence and excessive force to break up these protests. We saw this in two well-known examples in Lafayette Square in DC and in Portland, Oregon. On June 1st, people were peacefully protesting around Lafayette Square by the White House, calling for an end to racial injustice and police brutality. Suddenly, federal agents under the direction of Attorney General Barr used chemical gas, batons, rubber bullets, riot shields, and flashbang grenades to forcibly disperse the protesters and clear the area. Clearly, this was done so President Trump could get a photo op in front of St. John's Church. There was no anarchist violence in Lafayette Square. In fact, the only ones using force were federal law enforcement agents. Portland is another clear example where federal agents used excessive and indiscriminate force to break up people gathered to peacefully protest. On July 4th, unidentified federal agents arrived in Portland, outfitted as if for war, wearing camouflage and heavy gear. And to justify this unnecessary deployment of federal officers, President Trump and his administration have repeatedly portrayed Portland protesters as violent anarchists and members of Antifa. But in the past 4 weeks, what we have actually seen are federal agents beating up on nonviolent protesters, tear gassing them, and shooting them with rubber bullets and other so-called less lethal munitions. We saw federal agents shoot a 26-year-old nonviolent protester in the face with one of these less lethal munitions. And as you can see in the photo here, Donovan LaBella suffered skull fractures. He was in ICU. He required surgery. We saw federal officers beat a 53-year-old Navy veteran who approached them to ask why they were not honoring their oaths to the Constitution. And when Christopher Davis refused to react when federal agents beat him and broke his bones, they pepper sprayed him in the face. We saw federal officers tear gas moms, dads, and veterans who stood as a wall to protect peaceful young protesters. We also saw unidentified federal forces grab peaceful protesters off the street and force them into unmarked vans. One protester described having his hat pulled over his face so he could not see. I am not alone in my deep concern over the federal agents' use of force and violence against protesters in Portland. The Attorney General of Oregon has sued the federal government to stop federal agents from using the kind of, in quote, secret police tactics where they take people off the street and force them into unmarked vans. State and local officials in Oregon have demanded that federal forces leave Portland because they have brought violence, not peace. And the inspectors general of the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice have decided that the federal officers' use of force against protesters in Portland were concerning enough to open an investigation. The Justice Department's Inspector General has also concluded that the federal officers' use of force against peaceful protesters near Lafayette Square was concerning enough to include in its investigation. Despite these facts, we are having a hearing on protecting peaceful protesters from anarchist violence. But what we've seen in Portland are peaceful protesters in need of protection from federal officers. Let's be clear, once again, no one is condoning any violence by law enforcement or by the protesters. But by focusing only on anarchist violence, this subcommittee is furthering President Trump's efforts to distract us from the underlying issues that millions of protesters have been calling on us to address, the systemic racial injustice in our country. President Trump is deliberately trying to undermine the massive protests for racial justice by dismissing them as anarchists and Antifa. To perpetuate this narrative, President Trump has ignored factual evidence showing that white supremacists have hijacked peaceful protests to incite violence and stoke racial conflict, such as in Minneapolis. He has ignored studies showing that white supremacists have killed at least 329 victims in the past 26 years, while anti-fascists have killed no one in politically motivated attacks. And he has ignored what some have called the largest movement in American history, the millions of people who have marched peacefully in the streets following the murder of George Floyd, demanding change. If this subcommittee wants to protect Americans' right to peacefully assemble, we should be focused on preventing federal officers from beating up protesters, tear gassing them, and shooting them in the face. That's the hearing we should be having today. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would like to show a video that highlights the excessive use of force by federal agents in Portland. Thank you.
Hundreds of videos reviewed by The Times show that, although protesters were antagonistic, officers often responded with disproportionate force.
And this guy, wow!
They blanketed streets with tear gas.
Are you okay?
They struck protesters with batons and used flashbangs, pepper balls, and other less lethal munitions to clear the streets. Their actions often appeared to escalate rather than de-escalate matters, and in some instances they attacked when there was no apparent threat. On July 11th, protester Donovan Labella was at the federal courthouse when an officer appears to have fired at his head in retaliation for tossing a spent tear gas canister. Labella's mother told local media he suffered skull fractures and needed surgery. Later that night, when field medics sought officers' help for a wounded protester, they were aggressively cleared away.
Get up.
On July 18th, a Navy veteran was batoned and pepper sprayed in another unprovoked attack. His right hand was broken and he needs surgery. Sometimes members of the press were hit.
He got shot in the back, obviously, and he's wearing press.
This photographer, Matthew Lewis Rowland, told The Times that a volley of 10 projectiles were fired into his back.
Ow! God, what the... This way, don't worry about this.
In the middle of all this, protesters were detained in ways that alarmed civil rights advocates and former Homeland Security officials.
Can your people identify themselves as law enforcement?
On July 15th, several federal officers were filmed driving in unmarked vehicles in the blocks around the courthouse.
How are we supposed to know who you are? How are we supposed to know you're not kidnapping us and you're civilians kidnapping us?
One protester was detained at this location nearby.
What are you doing?
Federal officers wouldn't identify themselves,
Use your words.
but patches on the right and left sides of their uniforms match those used by members of BORTAC, the tactical unit from Customs and Border Protection. They drove the protester away in an unmarked car. DHS says federal officers have made 43 arrests since July 4th.